Hi, everybody. Thanks for your patience this morning as we get started with our summit. We want to welcome you to the 2025 Wild Horse Summit. Putting the A in advocacy, arming yourself to effectively advocate in 2025. I want to give a huge, giant shout out and thank you to my co-hosts today and throughout the summit, Chris Kaman with Chasing Horses Wild Horse Advocates, Jen Caudill with the Wild Narrative Project, and I am Heather Hellier with Save Our Wild Horses. We have a great selection of speakers who will be talking about wild horses and burros from around the world, our public lands here in the United States, livestock grazing issues, and ways to make your voice heard both in the media and with your legislators, both state and federal. Our goal is to provide you with facts you can use to advocate on behalf of wild horses and public lands. Wild horses need our voices now more than ever, and we must advocate for the change that we want to see. I want to remind everyone to please be respectful of our speakers and other participants in each presentation that we will have over the next 4.5 days. We will ask you to remain muted during each presentation, and if you do have questions, please put them in the chat box. After each presentation, we will do a Q&A where the moderator, Chris, Jen, or myself, will ask the speaker the questions for you. Each of the presentations will later be made available on Chasing Horses Wild Horse Advocates and Save Our Wild Horses YouTube channels, hopefully by the end of February. I hope you are all ready for a great summit because I know we are. Our first speaker that we're starting with today is Wayne McCrory from Canada. He is a registered professional wildlife biologist and independent consulting research scientist and conservation biology activist who resides on a small farm near the tiny mountain lake village of New Denver, British Columbia, in the remote heartland of BC's inland temperate rainforest. An honors zoology graduate from the University of British Columbia in 1965, his main research has involved grizzly bears and the white coastal spirit bears. He also has a wide range of research experience in many other species. Over the past 20 years, he has conducted research on wild horses in the BC Chilcotin grassland ecosystems in conjunction with the First Nation and several conservation groups. This includes a major genetic study of the Chilcotin wild horses with Dr. Gus Cothran of Texas A&M University. Wayne recently completed his second review of the Alberta free-roaming horse management for ZooCheck that for a second time proved there is no scientific basis for the Alberta provincial government's past and current plans to cull that wild horse population. Wayne, thank you for joining us today, and you are ready to go.
Okay, thank you so much. Hold on to your horses there, folks. I have had a lot of ground to cover, and some of it's quite weighted towards science, so I'll do my best to try and move things along. A lot of this presentation is based on my recent book, Wild Horses of the Chilcotin. You can contact me if you would like to order a copy. It's the most up-to-date book so far on, I think, not just Canada's wild horses, but the evolution and genetics of our North American horses. And many photographers and others contributed to this presentation. And we have far fewer wild horses left in Canada than you still have in the United States. There's only about 5,000 as a result of a century of eradication programs, and only some are protected. And even grizzly bears and wolves have been eradicated from most of the interior grasslands and all of the prairies. So in BC, we have about 3,000, in Alberta, about 1,500, in Saskatchewan, 35 to 125, and on remote Sable Island off the coast of Nova Scotia, about 500. And the only ones protected provincially are the ones in Saskatchewan, but it's not enforced, so they're not really protected, and their numbers have declined. And on Sable Island, they're the only ones really protected by federal legislation They're accepted as a naturalized wildlife by Parks Canada in a new national park. These are the Bronson Forest horses, what are left of them. And here we have Sable Island. It's hard to imagine horses surviving in such a harsh Atlantic ice landscape, but they do, and they've been there for a long time. So Alberta has about 1,500 left again after a century of bounty hunts. They're unprotected and they're our most threatened horse population in Canada today. The Suffield military base had 1,200 prairie horses, but they were eradicated in one fell swoop in 1994. So this is the Alberta foothills. In British Columbia, we have 2,800 in the West Chilcotin, and about 600 are protected in North America's largest wild horse preserve, established by the Hunter-Chilcotin First Nations. It's still not recognized by our national provincial governments, and the last century-round long bounty eradication program was in 1987. We've had no calls since then. We have 250 in the Highland Valley, and they're not protected, and there's some small feral herds on Indian reserves under Indigenous governance. So these two larger wild horse ecosystems are unique in that they still coexist with all of the top predators. Grizzly bears and wolves. You see a wolf standing here next to a band of horses. And some of my own background is I've spent 50 years working for wildlife and protection of wild areas with the Valhalla Wilderness Society. We've saved over 1.25 million acres of new parklands in British Columbia, including our white spirit bear in the coastal rainforest. And some of this work led to protection of 33% of the Great Bear rainforest. So I'm a bear biologist by profession. I've done tons of work for different provincial parks and national parks, mostly on bear risk assessment. And how did I get from studying bears to wild horses? Well, that's a long story. In 2001, I went to the Brittany Triangle in the West Chilcotin for the Hunter-Chilcotin First Nations and Friends in the Mai Valley to study grizzly bears. The area was threatened with my bear research dog, Lucy. And to give you some idea, you can see these are our interior grasslands. They're separated. Here's a coastal rainforest. Over here is the inland rainforest. And so we don't have the expanses you have in the US, but nonetheless, there are very rare ecosystems. And these red circles, this is the West Chilcotin, and this is the Highland Valley horses. The horses have already been eradicated from these areas, other than the red areas. So this is what's going on in BC, and the Brittany Triangle was being approached by this massive clear-cut logging. It was strongly opposed by the Hunter-Chilcotin First Nations, who blockaded and also went to the BC Supreme Court to try and stop the logging. And the West Chilcotin Hunter-Chilcotin are an ancient people that have lived on the land for thousands of years. They're an indigenous culture. It's a beautiful, intact landscape. And here we're looking at the northernmost grasslands that finger up into the coastal mountains in the distance. Many of the people still live traditionally on the land, including annual harvests of Pacific wild salmon and native plant foods. And when I got there in 2001 to study grizzly bears, I saw all these beautiful wild horses. It was just unbelievable. However, I had a serious problem with wild horses because as a young biologist in 1965, I lived in the Galapagos Islands and witnessed the negative impacts of feral animals on the fragile island ecosystem. I helped the campaign asking for the eradication of goats from the Galapagos, which has since happened. So I had this horrible entrenched attitude towards wild horses. But as I got working with the hunting team and started listening to their elders, some of them, like Canada's first wild horse ranger, Harry Sita, started my real education about their wild horses. And they regarded as a special being that they shared in the ecosystem going back into deep time of their ancestors. So their culture is an ancient one. But the relationship between the self-settler culture and Chilcotin wild horses I found was more challenging. While mapping grizzly habitat, we were not seeing that wild horses were overpopulated and were causing very little habitat damage. So we included them in our wild research and documented a healthy and diverse ecosystem that included the horses. But we focused on grizzly bears, which are very sensitive to roading and logging. And the work was somewhat challenging because they do pose a threat at times. This was a grizzly bear on the Salmon River that chased me and my research dog up the hillside, but we managed to get away okay. And when I started looking at the history, I found that, these were like you had in the States, killing fields. So most of our wild horses, which had been in the interior BC for 3 or 4 centuries, most of them had been killed off through bounty hunts and roundups. That included 15,000 after 1924, reducing their numbers to the 3,000 left today. Where I was doing my research, there was an old trapper, and he told me about the last BC bounty hunt where he got paid $40 per horse to shoot in this beautiful valley full of bunch grass to make way for range cows. I found working there for off and on for 20 years that the horses never return there. It's like they have elephant memories of their dead. This was a small band of guerrillas that showed up on the valley bottom, and as soon as they saw us, they left and they haven't come back. So these are our beautiful BC interior grasslands. That's the Fraser River, and they're now empty of wild horses and wolves and grizzly bears in most of the area. This is what the horses would have liked centuries ago. This is in the sagebrush grasslands on an Indian reserve where the First Nations put their horses out to graze over the winter and round them up in the spring. So our study concluded that this was a very rare ecosystem threatened by logging, and the grizzlies were threatened by trophy hunting. And the core refugium, larger than the US greater bear yellow ecosystem, with huge runs of wild salmon, lots of biodiversity, including trumpeter swans. We found that the horses weren't as sensitive to logging as outside of the study area as were grizzly bears. And so the research contributed to the establishment of BC's first large wild horse reserve by the First Nations. It's 770,000 hectares. I think that's something like 1.2 million acres. It's not recognized by the provincial and federal governments yet, but it's kept out the logging and elevated the status of our wild horses in Canada. So since that 2002 declaration of the Wild Horse Preserve, the Huntington achieved more protection through the Supreme Court of Canada, granting them a large area of tidal lands, which is this crosshatched area here. And most of the First Nations in British Columbia have never signed treaties. So we're in this huge process of reconciliation and with the First Nations for the past injustices, and some of their lands are being returned through court hearings and stuff. So they have almost exclusive management, what we have co-management between our settler culture and the First Nations elsewhere. In 2015, they added another 500,000 acres to the Wild Horse Preserve, mostly this beautiful intact grizzly bear salmon valley that has northern sort of limit of the wild horses. So we expanded the research to include the ancestry, the origins, impacts of wildfires, grazing impacts, eradication programs, natural wild horse population controls, and did more wild horse surveys. So we found that the indigenous cultures had horses for about 2 centuries before the coming of the fur trade that started in about 1808. And the first fur traders and explorers found the First Nations already had horses. And but from this area here, which is outside our study area, the horses and the grizzlies and wolves are already all gone. So we started asking, where did the horses come from? And of course, we found out, like you all have, that they evolved in North America over 50 million years. And some migrated over the Bering Land Bridge to Russia and then spread across Eurasia. In North America, they became extinct after the last ice age about 5,000 years ago. And the Spaniards were the first to introduce them back to the Americas about 500 years ago. That was to the east coast of Mexico. So how did they get from there all the way back to the remote Chilcotin? So, you know, we had this big mystery ahead of us. So we started this ancestry project, and guided by Dr. Cothran, the world equine expert from Texas A&M University, who was a huge help. And we started taking blood samples. And we also work with Dr. Orlando of the Center for Anthrobiology and Genomics in France to do genome sequencing, and of course, incorporating the Chilcotin First Nations oral history. So we divided our study area into a number of equine zones to do our sampling, and did a lot of hair collection, which was very challenging, especially in the freezing winter weather. This is one of our Chilcotin researchers. And the results were very interesting. We found that there were 2 isolated and genetically distinct wild horse subpopulations that would have been introduced by the Chilcotin at different breeds at different time periods. This is unique for North America. The main ancestry of the Brittany Triangle subpopulation is mostly Canadian, which is our national horse. It was first imported to Quebec in 1665, plus some Yakutian horse from East Russia. The rest of the West Chilcotin is mainly Spanish Iberian. And interestingly, there was no evidence of pre-Columbian or late Pleistocene horse genes. There was also no evidence that upbreeding attempts to release into the wilds of purebred stallions has influences the West Chilcotin wild horse populations. And this has been, the upbreeding program has been going on for a long time, starting with the Hudson's Bay, who brought on a sailboat to company, the fur company, who brought on a sailing ship to northern Hudson's Bay in the Arctic, a Norfolk trotter stallion called Fireway, and loaded him with some feed and canoed him on a bateau all the way up these rivers and portages to the interior grasslands to breed with the prairie ponies that the Hudson's Bay were using for hunting buffalo and stuff. And those horses were fine. They didn't need upbreeding, but that hasn't appeared to cause any genetic influence. And this just shows you the phenotype of the Canadian horse in the Brittany Triangle. Heavy set draft horse. The small Yakutian horse connection was interesting. There's only being found elsewhere in North America, I think in the Teddy Roosevelt horse population in the US. How they got here is a mystery. We looked at the trade trails between the interior and the BC coast for Ulukan oil, where Russian fur trade company had brought some Yakutian horses, but there was no way that they were brought in that way. So this is, science runs into mysteries and stuff, and very interesting. But the interesting thing about these horses is studies have shown that the Yakutian horse has a metabolic antifreeze that helps it survive today in the northern remote Arctic of Siberia in minus 65 degrees Fahrenheit winters. They don't even need to be put in barns. So some of these genes are in our Chilcotin wild horses that I think help them survive the severe winters. So the latest peer-reviewed study shows that the early dispersal of the horses across the Americas did originate mostly from Spanish horses that were brought in the 1500s. And it was actually the indigenous peoples that spread them across the Great Plains, and they reached our northern Rockies and northern Great Plains far earlier than thought in the early to mid 1600s. So this is remaking history. It's so fascinating. And here's some of the routes that horses were brought to the Central Americas. This is a somewhat outdated map in a wonderful book, Horses and Bridles, that shows the different trade routes by different First Nations. It's somewhat outdated as a result of the latest research that shows the dispersal was much earlier. And then some of the knowledge keepers that we interviewed showed that the horses were in the Chilcotin by the 1700s, if not before, which confirms the recent study I just mentioned. But then other knowledge keepers said that the Chilcotin had been there in the time immemorial. And the study I just cited stated that even though there's no genetic evidence of late Pleistocene horses, the indigenous scholars, scientists, authors allowed that from First Nations legends that First Nations likely had relationships with late Pleistocene horses, which is absolutely fascinating. So we then looked at natural wild horse regulation, and keeping in mind that the wolves present in our study area represent an ancient predator-prey relationship that went back to the Ice Age. And these are the same species of wolf that lived in the northern Yukon and Beringia that preyed on the Yukon horse. So this area has a very healthy population of wolves. And we had a biologist, Sadie Parr, do a study of wolf diet, collecting wolf scats. This is a wintering area. This horse had been shot by somebody and the wolves cleaned it up. And she found that the wild horses were a key component of the diet of wolves and maybe contributing to population regulation. And there was very use of salmon and cows. And on the BC coast, studies have shown that wolves feed heavily on salmon, so there's quite a difference. The Chilcotin also told us that the wild horses group up in the winter and from their smaller family bands into large aggregations. And you can see here an aggregation of 72 horses in wintering in a meadow in the winter that probably had grouped up to protect themselves from predators. So they're still shot indiscriminately here as vermin without consideration of the key ecosystem role they play, including predation on wild horses. And it's unfortunate, but that's still going on. We looked at mountain lions, and there seemed to be some predation. This is a domestic horse that was attacked at night in its corral. Mountain lions attacked usually the front regions. This old horse survived. And the remote camera set up by our researchers documented this camera in the valley the night before. So it's probably the one that hopped the fence and tried to kill the horse. Grizzly bears and black bears are very common, and there doesn't seem to be much evidence that they prey on the wild horses there. And this is a group of family grizzlies feeding on a dead carcass in the Alberta foothills. So it's an incredible ecosystem. Salmon bears, probably the bears aren't feeding much on wild horses because there's so much other food, including their major food source in the fall, which is the Chinook salmon and other salmon. The other regulating factor would be starvation winters. This is a near dead horse that I photographed in the spring. What was neat is its partner or mother was keeping a close eye on it and nursing it along. But the winters there are very harsh, and there are starvation winters. We looked at wildfires in our study area. Excuse me, had BC's largest fire in 2003. And this is some of the area burned. This is what you call a fire regenerated ecosystem. Wildfires are very common and part of the ecosystem. Most of our remote cameras burned, but one survived. And this camera shows the fire approaching the camera before it burned up the instruments, and it captured animals fleeing in the same direction ahead of the fire. This black bear, this mule deer, the black stallion, one of our study herds, heading off. After the big fire, some horses barely survived the winter for lack of grasses and sedges that were burned off. And one of our study herds I found in the spring had holed up in a deep snow area and eaten all the limited grass left in the burn, and it starved to death. So, but most appeared to have survived. This remote camera image of a horse with a cowbird as the fire approached is interesting. You see it on his back. And a month after, the remote camera, which survived, showed the horseback with the cowbird still riding on it. So we found many of our home study meadows were burning from peat fires. And so we got a bunch of volunteers and put out about 100 to help restore it. And those meadows have all restored. In 2017, the big Hansville fire burned part of the Wild Horse Preserve, and that was the Holocaust fire, which we're seeing more and more, as you know, from the news in California. And this burned up this whole herd of wild horses that was captured in the burn, in the firestorm, and the First Nations erected this memorial to them. So we looked at range studies, and it looked like it indicates cattle, not horses, are the mainly cause of historic range degradation. And international studies that showed a lot of these decisions to remove feral equids worldwide have been made on the assumption of competition between feral horses and other forms of wildlife and livestock without adequate knowledge of habitats, behaviors, and diets of feral equids. And I think that's true in the US as in Canada and elsewhere. So although wild horses have been documented causing some damage to habitats in the Chilcoot, no evidence they're causing significant damage. Most of it seems to come from cattle. And this is the range study that was done by a PhD graduate student with the Chilcoot and First Nations, and she found that there was very little change in the vegetation communities from the wild horses grazing the area. So we started in Alberta in 2015, I went there to start research on the wild horse management and attended a symposium and finally met Dr. Cawthron, the World Equine. And here we are showing people how you collect wild horsehair for DNA analysis. So Alberta's another sort of story of survival and not survival. Our last prairie horses were killed in 1994 on the Suffield military base. They were removed and sent to slaughter and adoption, and that was the last of them. We don't even know what their origins were. Fortunately, there's still 1,500 Alberta mountain horses in the ancient Fest grasslands and the Rocky Mountain foothills. Much is fragmented by industrial use and supports large numbers of cattle. Bison have been extirpated, but have been reintroduced next door in Banff National Park. So they're the last survivors, as in BC, of a century of bounty hunts and eradication programs. Alberta has divided their horse areas into 6 equine zones for management of culls and so on. We found that the Spanish horses were first introduced to the foothills by First Nations, such as Estonia Codas, in the early mid-1600s, the Canadian horse probably later. So Dr. Cawthron's study of one EMZ found the Spanish Iberian horses with some Canadian influence. Another genetic study had a low sample size, had a different result, but so this study didn't really say very much, but unfortunately it's being used by the government to justify the calls by saying these aren't special breeds, but escaped draft horses from farms and so on. So the Alberta government still practices controversial wild horse population reductions today, despite widespread public support for protection. Historic overgrazing by cattle, not the wild horses, has occurred. There's over 8,500 cattle and 1,500 horses. So there's 1 horse to 6 cows. In 2014, the Alberta government issued capture permits to remove 196 free-roaming horses from one of the EMZs. This did not happen thanks to the protests near one of the capture pens by Hawes, Wild Horse Advocacy Group, and others, and only 15 horses were captured. Government wild horse reductions unfortunately surfaced again last year, in 2003 with the Feral Horse Framework that set population control thresholds based on helicopter surveys. As I will get into, independent scientists' reviews found no hard evidence to support the culls. And these are beautiful animals and cherished by thousands of Albertans, and yet they're still threatened. So I did another review, science review, technical review, independent review, and found that the framework wasn't evidence-based. Using artificial minimum horse population counts to set thresholds for horse control fails to take into account that the horse populations, as the wild horse populations, undergo significant populations under oscillations from year to year. It also failed to take into account the role of natural ecosystem controlling factors like predation, droughts, starvation, immigration from one EMZ to another, which I'll get into shortly. Claims that EMZ free-roaming horses could negatively impact wildlife grazers such as elk not substantiated, and the intervention population control measures are really unwarranted and will do little, if anything, to restore rangeland health, as the horses are not the main cause of habitat degradation and rangeland health. So I won't summarize this, but we did look at range studies elsewhere, and there are certainly documented impacts of cattle on riparian ecosystems that were detrimental Similar results were found in the Alberta foothills. And all of this is being ignored, of course, by the government's feral horse management plan. It's not to say that the horses are grazing angels. They have been shown to cause overgrazing in other areas, impact riparian areas, such as in Idaho, and need to be carefully managed in that regard. So I don't want to portray the wild horses as not sometimes causing damage, but it's been greatly exaggerated. So this is more of the details we went into, and my review and that of others independent scientists, as I've noted, couldn't find any evidence that the horses were causing overgrazing. It was primarily cows. An agrologist, Brian DeCock, did a professional assessment of range health reports for some of the EMZs and found little evidence of horse damage when compared to the higher incidence from cattle, off-highway vehicle use, oil and gas development, and clear-cut logging. These study findings are consistent with our research in the Chilcotin wild horse study area and a recent study of impacts of feral horses on several grassland plant communities in a variety of U.S. Great Basin regions. The claim that in the feral horse framework that wild horses would support a larger population that may increase in predation on the wildlife also turned out to be somewhat unfounded. It turns out there was an elk study of wolves, mountain lions, and grizzly bears that concluded that increasing large predator populations do not necessarily equate to a loss in prey populations if habitats are sufficient to support the larger prey population, then the prey population should be able to support a larger population of predators. So I just want to touch on some of the studies that they have done there, which would be relevant to some of the US populations, such as the Pryor Mountains and maybe Colorado, where species wolves have recently been introduced, and some were shot recently, unfortunately, as part of your wolf recovery program there. So one of the studies radio-collared wolves from 11 packs and documented the kill site for wild horses and other species. And this is an area that had a lot of deer, elk, and moose, and a lot fewer free-ranging horses. Of the 192 ungulate kill sites examined, only 7% were horses, which equates to 14 horses. Most of the others were the other wild ungulates. However, when you convert to biomass, the horses being the highest, the free-ranging horses contributed to 12% of the total prey biomass killed by wolves. So when I extrapolated this to the 32 wolf packs estimated in the study area, keeping in mind that you have cattle, elk, ungulates, and everything else that's still living here with the wild horses, and you have 32 wolf packs in the study area, that's just pretty incredible. They would have killed a total of 42 horses over 3 winters of the 749 horses, which indicates pretty significant possible population control. So what's also interesting, and I think of value to those in the US where wolves are coming back to your wild horse areas, is a global review of wolves and free-roaming horses found wolf predation of horses reduces attacks on livestock, including cattle. And in Alberta, they did a cougar study. And here's some background. There has been studies in the US that showed that mountain lions and/or black bears killed 24 or 28 foals in Pryor Mountain Horse Reserves in 2004. And in Monterey Pass territory in the US, foals, predation of on foals by mountain lions effectively regulated a free roaming horse population. However, a study in Alberta found only limited predation by Rhedocollar cougars on free roaming horses. What is not known in Alberta is how many horses were killed in the same study area by unstudied component of the cougar population that were not Rhedocollared. Thus, it's difficult to conclude that the overall cougar population might not be that significant. I think it could be important in some years. So again, as in BC, there's little evidence that grizzly bears prey on Alberta mountain horses. However, there is some information that may be more on predation on foals. The other density dependent factors are droughts and starvation winters. This is recognized by the US National Research Council of National Academies. That the primary way that equid population is self-limited through increased competition for forage at higher densities, which results in smaller quantities of forage available per animal, poor body condition, and decreased natality and survival. In the Alberta wild horse grazing study concluded that nutritionally stressed horses can be predisposed to starvation under deep snow and severe weather. The authors also noted that large die-offs have been reported in BC and Alberta. And these are both areas, again, with extremely northern severe winter Chinook winds that melt the snow and cause icing of the food, and real deep freeze temperatures, subarctic temperatures. So these are the horses in most trouble, and I encourage you to join the efforts by Albertans to protect them through the two of the main groups. A recent poll shows 79% of Albertans want hands-off management and 76% want them protected. Now I want to just quickly summarize something that's really important in our debates and arguments and advocacy for saving our North American last wild horses, and that's their evolution. They're the most studied mammal in North America for their evolution. This is the Thomas Condon Paleontological Center in John Day, Oregon. One year, my wife and I decided to go on what we call a horse old bones tour. So we traveled south into the US, and you can see the very complicated evolutionary tree of the wild horse dating back 50 million years. And Canada and Alaska are some of the gold mines for fossil and frozen remains that help piece together this long evolutionary history of the wild horse. This is desiccated wild horse leg from an ancient Ice Age horse species that was recovered from the goldfield dredging in the Yukon. And this is the Hagerman horse in Hagerman, Idaho, which is an ancient horse that's recovered. There is a replica of bones recovered from a fossil site that we visited, just to get a feel for, really see yourself for the evolution of the horses. Even in BC, fossil bones of two Ice Age horse species dating back to 19,000 to 43,800 years ago have been found in the interior grasslands, only about 300 miles from our Chilcotin wild horse area. So it was quite shocking for me to find that in northern Yukon, where years ago I studied the porcupine caribou herd, was ice-free refugia during the last ice age, and had gray wolves and mammoths and several different horse species and saber-toothed tiger and caribou and so on. And this is what it looks like today. It's now, the whole area is now protected as a national wild park reserve managed with the local Gwich'in First Nations. And when I was studying caribou there in the 1970s, I started hearing about some of their ancient oral history. This is one of our caribou researchers, Charlie. And one evening around the campfire, he told us this incredible story about a mammoth that broke out of the Old Crow Flats and died on the banks of a river. So after that, he was guided by Charlie and one of his cohorts to the actual site, which they remembered, and where the bones still were, and they found the remains of a mammoth that died about 30,000 years ago. So this shows you how far back Indigenous oral history goes. North of Yukon is the Bluefish Caves, and there over a 19,000-year-old horse bone was found with human-made cuts. So this all helps us establish further what many biologists are now starting to believe, that the horse is not an alien species, it's a returned native species that evolved in North America. So in ending, here we are, same old thing, who's to bluff and who's to blame? The wild horse has been scapegoated by the ranching community for a century, and now the times are changing with all this new science and so many people speaking up. So in Canada, unlike US wild horses protected by federal law, and I know there's problems with that, Canada's last wild horses in BC and Alberta are still managed under archaic livestock acts as alien feral species with no legal protection. But the Chilcotin and others have shown us the pathway forward with their large wild horse preserve. Our last wild horses need to be protected as a valuable heritage icon for all societies and as a returned keystone native species that evolved in North America, and as a reminder of that wild horse spirit that exists in all beings. So they need to be removed from the archaic range management laws in the BC, Alberta. Strong legislation needs to be passed that includes First Nations government. And if there is strong evidence wild horses are actually causing range damage, limited but humane population regulations may have to be allowed. However, based on the current evidence that my research in BC and Alberta has shown, this is very, very unlikely going to be needed. So a lot of this has happened because this is in Nevada, a sign I ran into on our Old Bones tour, one less threat to livestock. This is probably near one of the wild horse refuges. And in closing, I'd like to thank all of those who supported and who were my teachers, and especially my wife, Lorna Visser, I was so busy writing my book on wild horses, called herself the Wild Horse Widow, and she has worked very hard to save this very marsh here and restore it in recent years. This was my mentor, part Mohawk biologist Robert Rattan, who is a caribou biologist who started saving wild horses in Alberta 40 or 50 years ago. And this is Marilyn Baptiste, the Chilcotin former chief, who won the Global prestigious environmental award for her work saving their land. And this is Chief Roger Williams, who's still the chief, was so instrumental in getting the Chilcotin Wild Horse Reserve established. And my friend Norman Williams, a knowledge keeper, who helped a lot with collecting wild horse hair. And if you go out with Norman, it's like this, you're going through this cultural library that overlays the land through his memory of all of the things he remembered about different burial sites and all kinds of history. Alice Williams, another researcher who was the editor of my Wild Horse book and who interviewed the elders for the project. Late wild horse ranger Harry Sita, who started educating me about wild horses. and my compadres, David Williams and John Huizinga on the right, who were always there out there helping do research in our challenging wild horse study area. And of course, Dr. Cawthron on the right, who so guided our research. And Ginger Catherines of her foundation, who actually was brought up to the Chilcotin on a film study to help us show us, look at our wild horses and help guide us in our research and with the film. So thank you all. And now you can open up to questions, I guess. Sorry it took so long.
Yeah.
It just had too much to cover in too short a period of time.
That's okay, Wayne. It was absolutely fascinating, and I think everybody would agree with me on that. We do have a few questions for you. I did put your email address in the chat box so that if people would like to order your book, they can contact you. And one of the questions was, how much is the book?
Oh, it's in Canada. I think it's about $50. So
Okay,
with the low exchange rate in the US, it'd be a lot cheaper. And you can buy it in bookstores in the US and so on, but we encourage people to buy it in your local bookstores.
perfect. You might have covered this in the presentation, but Michelle asks, would you know if the wild horses in Alberta have the same genetic makeup as the Chilcotin horses?
The ones west of Sundre are mostly Spanish Iberian, which is pretty much the same as the West Chilcotin subpopulation of wild horses outside of the Brittany Triangle. So, and the Alberta Cawthron study also showed that the Alberta wild horses have some Canadian horse ancestry. In the Chilcotin, we have two distinct subpopulations, however. So, although there's similar ancestry, the ones in the Brittany Triangle, which are isolated by two river valleys from the main West Chilcotin horses, which are Spanish Iberian, they're mostly Canadian with some Yakutian horse. And Cawthron's research, by the way, was confirmed by the genome sequencing done by Dr. Ludovic's lab. So yes, and much more genetic study needs to be done of the Alberta wild horses, but Dr. Cawthron's study certainly establishes that the more remote horses west of Sundre are Spanish Iberian ancestry. And keep in mind, as he pointed out to me, they're not going to really, because they've gone through so many mutations and so much history in their 400, 500 years they've been in North America since they were returned, they're not going to look exactly like the purebred Spanish Iberian horses you see in Spain and so on. So, yeah.
Okay, and we have a question from Jen. She would like to know, what are the indicators that cattle are the primary cause of damage and not the wild equines? For example, is it the way they eat or migrate, or the way they congregate in riparian areas?
I think it's a combination of all of that. It's sort of, I know there's some argument that the horses graze differently than the cattle and they have a different digestive system and so on. And that's certainly one of the arguments that's being used to emphasize that cattle are worse grazers than wild horses. The main evidence I looked at was actual grazing studies. That were done in the BC population and the Alberta foothills population. Some of them quite earlier by Salter and Hudson, where at that time you could send wild horse droppings to a lab in Moscow, Idaho, and they could analyze, and cattle droppings, analyze the content. So there really, in recent times, unfortunately, haven't been really any intensive studies done in both areas of the grazing impacts or potential grazing impacts of wild horses and cattle. but certainly the ones I looked at for Alberta, which used different methods, it wasn't significant in terms of wild horses. And the one by Sharon Preston done in BC in 1984, which is a pretty intensive study done in what's now the Wild Horse Preserve, where there were about 700 cows and 60 wild horses and 30 domestic horses are being turned loose. She certainly showed that the cattle were caught, where she did assess damage, were the ones largely responsible for the damage. But there are differences between their diets and so on. It's quite a complex issue. There's the Salter and Hudson study in Alberta is one that's worth burrowing into because it really goes into the differences between the diets of cattle and similarities between the diets of cattle, elk, and the wild horses. I don't know if that answers your question. It's a very complex subject.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I think this next question is a great one. I know down here in the United States, most of our herds, with the exception of Nevada, are fenced in, so they're not allowed to free roam. So, Tatiana wants to know, are horses overgrazing due to limited space? So, if there was no fencing, would we still possibly find areas of overgrazing by wild horses, or do you feel that free roaming, we wouldn't see that as often?
Yeah, I know. I did visit the Prior Mountain Horse Preserve and did go photograph with the nice young fellow who was darting the horses with the birth control drug at the time. And I sort of kept in touch with Nancy Cerrone, who's his mother, and looked at that area, quite closely. I don't know if that area is fenced, but certainly they're free roaming, and it appears that cougar predation there is a significant controlling factor at some times. But of course, they are using artificial birth control of some of the mares too. So I think part of the problem in some of the U.S. herds is they're either overhunting the cougar predators because the cougars as your predator, and opposing the return of wolves to their former habitats. That's being done in Colorado, for example, through your very forward-thinking Endangered Species Act. And I think stop reducing some of the aggressive cougar control measures in some of your herds under claims they're killing the cows and stuff. There has to be some more allowances for these predators there to restore their role as a population control vector. I would also say that if you don't have this natural control in your fenced-in horse populations, such as from predation or hard winters and stuff, that fencing in is probably, contributing to some of the range damage. But then, in some of these areas, how many cows are still out there in the range? Usually it's a lot more than the horses.
Exactly.
So it's very complex. And I'd have to actually look at all the background research and visit the area myself, as I have in Alberta and BC, and talk to people to really give a adequate professional opinion, I guess. I don't want to sound like a big expert here.
Carrie Ferguson with the Cloud Foundation has two quick questions for you. She would like to know if there are any new or upcoming studies or conservation projects focused on the Canadian wild horses that we should be aware of.
No, there aren't at this point. There was a graduate study finished a year or two ago in Alberta. Dr. Johniki Bakariga who finished her PhD on our Chilcotin wild horses, is now coordinating the big new Dazaquatasico tribal park component of the Wild Horse Preserve for the First Nations, trying to get the province to agree to protection. But no, there aren't any that I'm aware of. And certainly the Alberta government should take the lead role in actually doing the baseline range research, staring them in the face. It's badly needed to really look at what's happening there, or which I'm guessing would probably match the previous findings that the horses really aren't causing much damage. But you know, I don't want to jump the gun there. So no, there's nothing, and there should be more for sure.
Her second question is, what can advocates and the public do to best support conservation efforts for Canadian wild horses?
Right now it's, and I meant to have that in my PowerPoint, and somehow that page got excluded, is ZooCheck, which is based in Toronto. They funded my 2015 and 2023 review of the feral horse management there. And HAWS, Help Alberta Wildlife Society, which is the main advocacy group based in Sundre, Alberta. So those are the two main ones, fighting the potential for horse population reductions in Alberta. And they're very strong, science-based, and doing a great job. In BC, it's not an issue right now. There's a Canadian Wild Horse Defense League and some First Nations, but because we haven't had any indications of calling of the Chilcotin wild horses or any hints by the BC range managers since the 2018 wild horse bounty hunter, 2008, I can't remember. It's not really an issue. Most BC people are not even aware we have wild horses. So, and we're so focused on the excessive clear cutting of our old growth forest and our campaigns to protect these large wilderness areas for grizzly bears, and you know, old growth forests with 1,500-year-old trees. The Valhalla Society has, which I work with, we will be doing more wild horse advocacy soon, and more on our website, and trying to meet with the BC agricultural minister to present all this information to try and get BC to pass provincial legislation to protect our last wild horses, along with First Nations governance. But a lot of our time is occupied by although the BC government has a program to protect our last wild horse, old growth forests, which are incredible and necessary to protect to help mitigate climate change. They are left-wing NDP government, it's called, which is just re-elected, is so sold out to the logging companies that they haven't really moved to protect much. We did protect a 58,000 hectare large area in our proposal last year, which was wonderful. You know, it has 1,800-year-old cedar trees and stuff. So there's a lot going on in BC, and wild horses aren't very much on the radar screen, and they're currently not that threatened. But Alberta is sort of the war zone right now and needs the most help.
Yeah, most definitely. And Daryl with Haas is definitely doing some great work over there. I have a question from Abby. She says, what is the prevailing perspective on the limited free roaming horses currently in the Yukon?
I think there's a group there that is working to have them protected. I think there's about 100. I haven't really had much contact with them. I have seen them in my former travels in the Yukon a long time ago, and the ones I saw were sort of along the highway. So I'm not sure what the status is, but certainly they're worth saving. There are some feral horses in remote northern BC that are escaped horses from released domestic horses that were just never recollected by the guide outfitter operations that operate there. And there's been some genetic studies there, but people just sort of leave them alone. And yeah, so I don't know much about the Yukon horses, but certainly people are working to keep them, and I think that's very worthwhile.
Perfect. Let me see. We have just a little bit more time here. Cecile would like to know, does the mentioned healthy wolf population also prey on cattle?
Do they prey on cattle? Yes, they do at times. We have the conservation officers in BC have a program where if it's proven that a wolf has preyed on killed cattle, there is, I think, a compensation program, and and they will destroy if they can identify the wolf or the bear that has killed the cattle, but it doesn't seem to be that prevalent as far as I know. Unfortunately, because our mountain caribou and our inland rainforest have been so decimated by clear-cut logging and snowmobile use, we have a major recovery program, and there is quite a bit of habitat protected and some progress, but we have they're shooting wolves packs and mountain lions from helicopters in caribou habitat to try and hold the population. So we're opposed to that, but the wolf cattle predation issue isn't that big an issue and concern as far as I know. And certainly out in the West Chilcotin, the Sadie Parr study found that wild horses were the biggest component of the wild horse diet, and cows were very little. And we deliberately collected in cattle areas to try and counter the claims that the wolves were preying a lot on the wild and free roaming horses, but they really aren't. There's not a lot of that goes on. And I think I showed a picture earlier from the Namaya Valley of a herd of horses with poles and a wolf hanging out nearby. So
Great. And just one last comment from Sandy Sharkey. She would like to just point out that Alberta's wild horses, or wildies, are now being referred to as Alberta mountain horses in order to elevate their public persona. This is a tip of the hat to Wayne, who helped to create the term Great Bear Rainforest and Spirit Bear. Thank you, Wayne.
Yeah, I think it's a great name too, much better than wildies.
Yeah, I think we would agree with you. All right, that looks like that's all the questions we have for today, Wayne. I want to thank you for joining us and for offering to do a presentation with us as well. It was absolutely fascinating. And for everybody, again, we're going to have all of our presentations available on our YouTube channels, hopefully by the end of February. So you can refer back to it if you want to listen to it again or share it with your friends and family who were unable to join us today. And again, thank you, Wayne, for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you everyone for my all too long presentation. And I'm sorry to be so long-winded, but there's so much to share that's so fascinating. And keep up all your good work. I support all of you, and we're all getting there.
We are absolutely. Thank you, Wayne. All right. Thank you, everybody. We're going to have a short 18-minute break here, and our next presentation will be Chris Kaman with Chasing Horses, Wild Horse Advocates. So I'm going to close this session down, and to join Chris's, you will just need to find your Zoom link for that one. Thanks again, Wayne, and everybody have a great day.